the Lancastrians decide to stand and fight just south of Tewkesbury. So a number of the Lancastrian leaders get into Tewkesbury Abbey, where they try to claim sanctuary. But Edward is having none of it. And essentially, with his troops, he enters the Abbey and he drags them out.
Is Margaret of Anjou.
That's it for her. This is her, very much her last hurrah. And so after this, she's lost her husband. She's lost her son. So what is there to fight for? And what ultimately for her is a foreign country.
Welcome to the British History Channel with me, Philippa Lacey Brewell, and to our latest historian interview. Hello again if you are a returner, and a warm welcome to you if this is the first time you have been to my channel. If you love British history, then you're definitely in the right place. If you take a look, we have a whole library full of historian interviews, virtual tours, mini historical documentaries, and you can also find me here live every Wednesday at 1 o'clock for Tea Time History Chat Live. But today I am talking to Julian Humphrys about the Battle of Tewkesbury. It was a bloody clash that brought to a halt the Wars of the Roses in May 1471. The Yorkists under Edward IV beat the Lancastrian forces, and Henry VI's only son and heir, Edward, Prince of Wales, was killed. So Julian read history at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, before spending 12 years at Chelsea's National Army Museum, setting up special exhibitions and acting as spokesman to the media on all matters military history. He has acted as historical expert on a number of TV programmes, including Channel 5 select series on British battlefields. He's featured a number of times on BBC Radio 4's Rambling series and made 3 expeditions to Bosnia during the Civil War to record the British Army's activities there. Julian set up and led English Heritage's Battlefield Hikes programme, and in 2009 was appointed Development Officer of the Battlefields Trust. He lectures and writes on many aspects of British history. He's a regular contributor to both BBC History and History Revealed magazines, and has published a number of books. Now, as usual, members of the British History Patreon Club have been able to submit their own questions for Julian, and I will put those to him at the end of the main interview. That makes up the extended ad-free version of this interview. If you'd like access, as well as the opportunity to ask any future guests your own questions, and a host of other history lover benefits as well, including being part of our book club, it's all for £5 a month, and you can join at www.patreon.com/British history. But today, let's get on talking about the Battle of Tewkesbury with Julian Humphrys. Julian, welcome to the British History Channel. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to this.
Well, I've given everyone a brief introduction to you and your background and your work, but in your own words, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, well, hi, everybody, and thanks for taking the time to listen to me. So I'm Julian Humphrys, and I've been talking about battles really for about 40 years. I used to work at the National Army Museum in London, which tells the story of the British Army, and that's where I kind of started my guiding around battlefields. I also do work for English Heritage. Their new programme of battlefield hikes is out, if you remember, and I'm wandering around the country for that. I write a little bit. I've just finished a book or co-authored a book on battlefield hikes around the world, although I've restricted myself to the UK on that, but there are better equipped people to do the rest. I do a lot of guided tours around the country, and I'm one of the trustees of the Battlefields Trust. So it's great to talk about Tewkesbury because it's one of our key battlefields, and we in the Battlefields Trust try and preserve and interpret those battlefields and make people interested in them. So it's good to do this because we're doing it right now, aren't we?
Indeed. So, well, let's get into it then. So can you give us some context around the battle? What's the situation in the country at this time?
Right. Well, first thing to say about the Wars of the Roses, I think, is that they are wars. They're not the War of the Roses. In other words, it's not one drawn-out conflict. It's a series of conflicts, maybe 3 main periods of fighting. And the Battle of Tewkesbury is in the second of those periods of fighting. And it brings to an end about 2 years of rebellion and civil war. But perhaps to understand that very, very quickly, we'll go back to what it's all about and what the Wars of the Roses are all about. So, we'll go back to the 1450s, and really what brought about the Wars of the Roses, in brief, was, I suppose, the inadequacies of Henry VI as a ruler. If you're going to be king at that time, you've got to know how to handle your aristocracy, really, because you rely on them for government. And if you don't divvy up the jobs, for example, you can run into difficulties. And Henry VI was a very weak, mentally unstable monarch who was prone to favouritism. He particularly liked the Beauforts, or at least perhaps his wife, Margaret of Anjou, very powerful figure, more of a man than Henry ever was, really, favoured the Beauforts. Now, that rather hacked off another branch of the royal family, the House of York, and we're talking here about Richard of York. This isn't Richard of Gloucester, the future Richard III. It's his dad, Richard of York. And Richard of York had a claim to the throne through both his mum and his dad, but really, he wanted to be at the centre of government, would be the way to look at it. He wanted to be essentially the protector of the realm, particularly in those periods where Henry VI had periods of mental instability. And of course, if you are at the centre of the realm, it means that you benefit from royal patronage and you can distribute patronage yourself. And he found himself isolated. And so the first part of the Wars of the Roses can be seen really as that struggle between Henry of Lancaster's supporters and, on the other hand, Richard of York and his supporters. By supporters there, I mean the family that are going to be key at the Battle of Tewkesbury in many ways, and that's the Nevilles. Now, the Nevilles, the most famous of the Nevilles, is Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, and he's often described, as the classic example of the overmighty noble, and to a certain extent he was. Although to say he was perhaps ambitious is perhaps to get it a bit wrong, because when he was a child, he was married off to one of the Beauchamp family. And as a result, he got this enormous inheritance that he didn't choose to have, a huge inheritance across the country. So he had the Neville lands, but he also had the Beauchamp lands. And as such, he was one of the most powerful and rich nobles in the country. And as such, he was able to intervene in politics and warfare effectively, but also he kind of expected to be consulted in things if he helped somebody. And help, indeed, he did, because Richard of York was killed in 1460 at Wakefield, and the Yorkist cause was really carried forward by Richard's son, Edward of March, the future Edward IV. And Edward IV was really crowned as an alternative to Henry VI. And he was triumphant at a battle outside of York, at a place called Taunton. Huge battle, very bloody battle. But what it essentially did was it destroyed the Lancastrian forces, and it enabled Edward IV to act, or to become king, really, and rule he did then from 1461. And of course, one of the people that had been a key player in him becoming king was Warwick, Richard Neville, or Warwick the Kingmaker, as we sometimes now refer to him, or many people refer to him as that. And having, done the heavy lifting really for Henry, for Edward IV, you could say that Warwick expected to reap the rewards. Now, what would they be? Well, they would be a central place in government, a say in foreign policy, a say in national policy, and good marriages for his daughters. He had 2 daughters, and with this huge inheritance to deal with, he wants to get good marriages for them. And there we are. So that's what he's expecting. But things don't quite work out that way, because one of the accounts of the ending of this period of the Wars of the Roses, it sort of drags on until 1464, because the Lancastrians had a lot of castles up in the northeast, places like Bamborough, Dunstanburgh, Alnwick, these mighty castles in the northeast. And it took a long time for the Yorkists to essentially capture them all. And it's said that the Nevilles, so Warwick and his brother John Montague, did this. And it said, one of the accounts said, whilst Edward enjoyed the pleasures of the chase. Now, the chase in question, you could say, well, it's hunting, but it was probably Elizabeth Woodville, because Edward married secretly this Lancastrian widow, Elizabeth Woodville, who appears to have been pretty good looking, but it looks as though she wouldn't come up with the goods that Edward was hoping she'd come up with unless he married her. So he seems to have done this in private. Now, this is a kind of tricky situation, and it really causes the fighting that we are going to hear about in a few minutes, because Warwick didn't know about this, and it's said that he announced at court that he'd come up with a great plan for a continental marriage for Edward IV. And you imagine them all in court, can't you? And then Warwick said, this is what we're going to do, and we do this and we'll get an alliance, and so on and so on. And Edward had to say, well, actually, Richard, I should have told you this a little bit earlier, but I'm already married. Well, who to? To Elizabeth Woodville. What? That Lancastrian, low-born Lancastrian. So it's a humiliation for Warwick, but it's worse than that, because with Elizabeth Woodville came a large number of relatives. Now, the Nevilles had a large number of relatives as well. And over the years, the Nevilles married into all the families, even the families that they ended up fighting against, like the Percys. But, it's a good judge if you pull back a medieval noble bedspread in this period. There'd be a Neville on one side of the bed or the other, So they're kind of hoovering up the marriage market. And as I mentioned, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, he wanted to marry off his two daughters as advantageously as possible. But suddenly, there's another family getting in the way over this. And the Woodvilles start to hoover up the marriage market. And Neville is losing influence. And as a result of that, he feels, well, I've backed Edward all these years. I should not be sidelined. And of course, if I am sidelined, my inheritance that was, legally, it was a tricky inheritance that's going to be challenged. And so as a result of that, you get this break between Edward IV and his old supporter, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. And this enables the rump of the Lancastrians, by which I mean, in particular, Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI's wife, to take advantage of the situation. And so over the 2 years preceding the Battle of Tewkesbury, you get a situation where Warwick is trying to undermine Edward IV. He's trying to control him. So at one stage, in fact, he foments a rebellion, and the rebellion is successful enough, and he actually has Edward IV in custody. But it was very tricky to rule through Edward without Edward cooperating, and they give up on this. And when another rebellion against Edward fails, Warwick goes into exile, and he hooks up with Margaret of Anjou, so Henry VI's wife. Now, it should be said at this point that Henry VI is not dead. He is a shadow of a king, really. He we often say perhaps he would be better suited to be, an abbot or something, but I don't think he even could have done that. There would have been uproar in his monastery as he said one thing one day and then changed his mind the next, and said yes to the first monk that spoke to him and then said yes to the next one, etc. But there we are. So Henry VI has not been killed. He's a prisoner in London. But his wife is very keen, to restore him. Not, I think, because she thinks that Henry VI is an able monarch, but to her, he's the rightful monarch. But more importantly, somehow she and Henry VI managed to have a son. Now, there's a lot of debate about this, because Henry VI is not normally seen as, let's say, the most manly of monarchs. And even at the time, people said, well, he cannot have fathered this son. It was probably, the Earl of Somerset or James Butler. He was a good-looking chap. I bet it was him. But there was never, Henry clearly saw this son as his heir. And it was really Margaret's refusal to see that heir disinherited in a peace idea that they had earlier, where Henry would rule And then when he died, Richard of York and his offspring would become king. But I think that Margaret was not prepared to see her son, Edward, who by the time of the battle is about 17. He's about that. I think he's 17 at the time. He sees him as the future of the Lancastrians. And she sees this falling out between Warwick and Edward IV as an opportunity to restore Henry VI, and with it, the Lancastrian dynasty. Interesting chap, young Edward. I think he certainly didn't take after Henry VI. He seems to have taken up after perhaps more his granddad, Henry V, and Margaret, because the Milanese ambassador said that even in exile, he was talking about cutting off heads and battles and what have you, as though he was king already. And it is said that at an earlier battle, he instructed two Yorkists that had stayed with him or stayed with his father to guard his father and were captured, who'd been quite loyal really to Henry VI, but he ordered them to be executed, probably at the behest of his advisors. But there are, so he's a pretty tough individual. This is not some child that we're talking about, Prince Edward. So there's a situation. We've got a situation where I guess Warwick has fallen out with Edward, and as a result of that, Margaret of Anjou sees her chance, and they have a rapprochement. Now, they were old enemies, Warwick and Margaret, and it's said that when they met, Margaret kept Warwick on his knees for 15 minutes before she would even talk to him. But she saw him as an opportunity, as he saw her as an opportunity. So this is an extraordinary alliance of convenience, really, between Warwick and Margaret of Anjou. And it works initially. Warwick is able to overthrow Edward IV, and Edward IV goes into exile with his mate, William Hastings, and his younger brother, Richard of Gloucester, the future Richard III. They go over to the Low Countries to Bruges in exile. And we have this period called the readaction, which is essentially the victorious Warwick and Margaret going into the Tower of London, pulling out poor old Henry VI, sprucing him up a bit and parading him through the streets of London. Here is your king. But I think it backfired spectacularly, because Edward IV was a strapping lad. He had a lot of charm about him. He seems to have been able to win people over. He's the sort of guy, I suppose, a bit like Robbie Williams, I always think, that men wanted to be him and women wanted to be, shall we say, with him in that way. So Edward IV had all of this charm. He was a good soldier. He was the very image of what a king should be. Poor old Henry VI was none of those things. So you can imagine this sad figure being led through London on a horse, not really knowing what's going on. So it's probably not going to work.
What was his mental health like at the time he was released from the tower?
Right. Well, he had these periods of mental collapse. Maybe it's overstated, I think, how often this happens. But I think at this time, I don't think he was in one of his, at an earlier period, he seems to have been pretty catatonic at times, but I think at this period, he's not like that. But I think he just kind of reacts to things. He's got no powers of leadership whatsoever. So as a king, he's totally unsuitable. As a sort of relative, you'd say he was better than he was before, but I don't think that you could say any more than that. So he's if he ever was a force, he's now very much a spent force. So he's if you ever want an example of a puppet monarch, this is your man. That's how I think to think about it. So Edward is not the kind of person to just give up. And so this is happening incidentally 1469 to 1471, and in early 1471, Edward IV returns to England. Lands up on the east coast, and he's joined by the forces of, amongst others, William Hastings, who was his big mate, and they got a force together. And in many ways, the key player at this period is the other brother of Edward IV, Clarence.
I was about to ask, where is he? Yes.
So he is a character that has ambitions of his own. Ultimately, he overplays his hands, and famously in Shakespeare, at least, he was drowned in butt of Malmsey wine, although I doubt that really happened. I think it's just a sort of a gag almost, that meet a fitting end in that way. But, he initially supports Warwick. Now, this makes it very difficult for Edward IV, but Edward IV, is able actually to, in a piece of theatre, really, Edward's meets Clarence, and Clarence has his forces there, and Clarence changes sides and he joins Edward IV. And this is a kind of key moment, really, because it weakens Warwick's position. With Clarence on his side, I think that Warwick would have been very difficult to cope with. At this time, incidentally, it should be said that Warwick is back in England. He's overthrown Edward IV, and he's now ready to do battle against Edward. Margaret is still over on the continent, and she's setting sail for England, and she's heading for the West Country because there's a certain amount of Lancastrian support in that area. Families like the Courtneys, for example, who had been out and out Lancastrians through the Wars of the Roses. The Beauforts had a lot of land in the southwest, so she's going to go down there, and she's eventually going to land at Weymouth, but we'll come on to that a little bit later. And then on the 14th of April, the two armies, that of Edward IV and that of Warwick the Kingmaker, clash at Barnet, which, if you don't come from England, it's just north of London, and you can get to it on the subway. It's one of the few battlefields you can actually reach by taking the tube, as we would say in these days. So it's up one of the great North roads, and it's a very confused affair, this battle. It's very foggy, so nobody could quite see who was where. The two armies didn't line up properly opposite each other because they couldn't quite see where they were in the fog. And as a result, one side of the battle is a success for the Yorkists under Edward. The other side is a success for the Lancastrians, and it was a man called John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, who would later command Henry VII's vanguard at the Battle of Bosworth. And on one side, the Yorkists are successful and they drive back the Lancastrians. On the other side, de Vere is successful, but he's not able to keep his troops under control. And they're a little bit tempted by the shops of Barnet down the road. So off they go, do a lot of pillaging. And when they come back in all the fog, they're mistaken by the rest of the Lancastrian Warwick's army as returning or Yorkist reinforcements. And the Lancastrian army dissolves in this sort of infight where they start attacking each other. Disaster, of course. The Lancastrian army dissolves into flight, and many people are killed in that flight, including John Neville, Marquis of Montague, and his important brother Warwick the Kingmaker. They're both slain in this fight, and really that is a sort of crushing end to the Neville dominance in this period.
So they're killed in this odd fracas that happens after.
Yeah.
Wow.
So now this has huge impacts, of course, because long term, because the Nevilles have got a lot of land, lots of land. They've got a lot of land in the north of England, in particular. That's important because they were a counterbalance to the Percys, Earls of Northumberland, who tended to be more often than not Lancastrian. They tended to be. So the Nevilles have got a lot of land up there. And also, the Nevilles over the years had always been an important cog in the defensive machine against the Scots. So you got to have somebody up there that's going to replace the Nevilles. So, you're Edward, you think, well, who can I trust that I can send up north? The brother, Richard. And so Richard of Gloucester is given all this land in the north of England. People sometimes say, oh, well, he's from York. He's not. He's a Midlander. He's born at Fotheringay in the East Midlands. But he's sent up and he's given a lot of estates, Neville estates in the north, which he also will strengthen later by marrying Anne Neville, who is Warwick the Kingmaker's daughter. So all of that ability, really, of Richard, to intervene on national politics, and that idea that you hear that he favours Northerners, and it's one of the reasons why he doesn't get acceptance in the South when he seizes power in 1483. But much of it comes from this battle at Barnet. Okay, so Edward has won the Battle of Barnet. It's said that it was a costly battle, and that one of the accounts, there's a very useful account of all of this. It's called The Arrival. And it basically it's written by a clerk of Edward the Fourth about the whole campaign, about what happened. Obviously, because it's written by a clerk of Edward the Fourth, it's going to be pro-Edward. But it does discuss tactics, strategies, decisions at a level that few other things do. And so we do rely very heavily on this account. It's not the only account, you've got other things that are written, there or shortly afterwards. Warwick's Chronicle, for it is another example, written maybe 1480. But the contemporary account is very much The Arrival. And it says a lot about what happened. One account says about Edward's army that they went out, on fine horses and in splendid armor. They came back badly wounded, without noses, and on paltry nags. So it gives you an idea about the brutality of the fighting. So Edward has won, but his army has suffered quite heavy casualties, really, in the fighting to defeat Neville. So on the very day that this battle is fought and won, Margaret lands at Weymouth. Now, you'd think in a way that she would see, and her advisors would see, the defeat of Neville as a disaster, because it's half of their army destroyed, isn't it? Half of their supporters destroyed. But it does appear that they didn't see it that way. And it's quite clear that they only supported the Nevilles because the Nevilles were enemies of Edward IV. And they almost appear to have been quite glad about it, because first of all, they felt that it meant that people that maybe didn't like the Nevilles might come and join them. So old Lancastrians might come and join them who'd been held back because they didn't like the Nevilles. And I think they probably saw it in the same way that maybe William the Conqueror would have reacted to the Battle of Stamford Bridge up in the north of England, where Harold Godwinson defeats the Viking invaders, Harold Hardrada. He wins the battle, but his forces are badly weakened in that whole campaign. But what he'd done is he'd taken a potential rival out of the equation. So maybe actually the forces of Margaret, okay, Neville's gone, well, who cares? He's weakened Edward. We never liked him anyway. We can deal with this on our own. But of course, now they're going to have to deal with it on their own, and they're going to have to face up to Edward, who is a very vigorous campaigner, and he heads off westwards to take them on.
Okay, so we've got Edward IV's army licking their wounds north of London. Margaret and her forces have landed at Weymouth. Is Edward IV aware that Margaret is on her way? At what point are they aware of each other's presence? And take us through that, and then what happens next?
Okay, well, it takes a little while, I think, for Edward to be aware of this. I think he was aware that an invasion was in the offing, but actually, perhaps luckily for him, he was over at Windsor, I think, when he heard the news. And the reason for this was that he was doing a Garter ceremony there, the Order of the Garter. And of course, this was, he's re-established himself as king. And I think by holding that Garter ceremony there, he's making a public statement, isn't he? That, here I am king. Incidentally, he didn't maltreat the bodies of the Nevilles. He displayed them in London so that people could see that they were dead. So he's sort of acting, as monarch at this point. He's making a few points. A, I've defeated my opponents, my key opponents. B, it's business as usual, really, I suppose, is the way to look at that Garter ceremony. So he's now on the right side of London to deal with an assault on London by the Lancastrians. So that's not what the Lancastrians do. I think that they feel that they're rather short of men, and so they're going to need to get some reinforcements. Now, where can they get any reinforcements? Wales, where you could definitely count on the support of Jasper Tudor. So that is in fact what the Lancastrians decide to do. And it was really, really hot. It was very, very hot this period, incidentally. And the accounts say that the troops were thirsty, exhausted, etc. But despite that, both armies march very quickly. Edward gathers together his forces, and learning about what the Lancastrians are planning to do, and he can probably work. He might have had news that they're heading north, rather than up towards London. His plan is, I'll get to the West Country, and if I can intercept, what I want to do is to intercept the Queen. She's got with her Edmund Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset. The Beauforts had always been big Lancastrian supporters, and a veteran soldier in John Wenlock, Lord Wenlock, who had been around forever. Really, he was there in the 100 Years' War, at the beginning of the 100. Well, in the beginning of the English occupation of Normandy in the 1420s. He'd been a governor of a town in Normandy, so a veteran old soldier, really, an old diplomat. Always a big pal of Warwick, so he can't have been very pleased when he heard that Warwick he joined the thing, really, because I think he supported Warwick rather than any great love for Margaret of Anjou, who had employed him but sacked him at an earlier stage in his career. But so they're coming across, but they feel, I don't think they've got enough men. If they can get to Wales, there's a good chance of getting men there. But although they march as quickly as they can from Weymouth, the advance there was held up. Partly because they were a bit short of stuff and they had to make a detour to Bristol. So instead of heading straight to Wales, they go to Bristol. And then the next place they come to, which would have been the ideal perhaps place from which to make a crossing, was Gloucester, but Gloucester won't let them in. Gloucester denies them entry. So they could sort of stop and try and storm Gloucester, but that's not, with the number of troops that they've got. This could have been fatal, to attempt to storm it. Even if they captured Gloucester, I think they would have lost a lot of men. So they abandon that and they carry on north, looking really to find a crossing over the River Severn. And there is, of course, one at Tewkesbury. And so the idea is for the Lancastrians. So, as I say, just to reiterate, you've got Margaret of Anjou, you've got the heir to the Lancastrian throne in Edward. You've got the Duke of Somerset. They've been joined by the Earl of Devon. They've got Lord Wenlock there, and they're trying to get across into Wales, but they've got to get across the River Severn. Now, you can't just pop across the river. It takes a long time. You've got to queue up and wait your turn, and then some cart gets stuck in the ford, and you've got to mend that, etc. So, and you're all, it takes a while to do that. So, what you don't want is an enemy army turning up as you're attempting to do it. And that's exactly what happens. Edward is showing incredible energy with his army, and they hot-foot it from Windsor westwards in an attempt to catch the Lancastrians before they can cross into Wales. They very nearly actually caught the Lancastrians before at Chipping Sodbury, but the Lancastrians avoid this. And on they go. So on the 3rd of May, 1471, the Lancastrians have got to Tewkesbury. So they've reached the place where they want to make their crossings. But they're well aware that, the Yorkists under Edward IV are not far behind. So the last thing they want to do, as I say, is be attacked by the Yorkists as they're trying to get across the river, because they won't be in battle array. They'll all be queuing up to get across the river. Half of them might be across the river. The other half might not be. Disaster. And all of this, it's incredible, the speeds. The Lancastrians did the last 24 miles, it said, in 16 hours. Now, for an army at that time, that is quite impressive.
And back to what you're saying about the heat, we are in England, but England can get very hot in May.
Yeah.
and
they're carrying stuff, aren't they?
And they're carrying stuff.
And if you're wearing armour, who knows whether that those that had armour wore it all the time.
So potentially they're in metal with the sun beating down on them.
Exactly. You think about the end of any kind of marathon when they give you those metal sort of blankets to keep the heat in. Well, these guys, whatever, if they're not wearing the stuff, it's got to be carried. So oxen get tired, horses get tired, people get tired. So they're exhausted. But so are Edward's troops, but they do the same thing. They catch up with them. So on the 3rd, of May, the Lancastrians are in Tewkesbury, but they realise that they're not going to be able to cross the river without fighting a battle. What they're going to have to do is fight the Yorkists, and if they can drive them back, that will buy them the time then to go across the river if they choose to, or if they manage to win a spectacular victory, they might not need to. So either way, the Lancastrians decide to stand and fight just south of Tewkesbury. And that is the background really to why there was a battle fought at Tewkesbury. So it's the rump of the Lancastrians. The Nevilles have been knocked out of the equation. And this is the last chance, really, you could say, I think, for Margaret and her hopes for her son. So that can they win the following day at Tewkesbury?
And how much of a role does Margaret have at this point then in the strategy, the decision making?
I think that the way I see Margaret is that she has a major role in the policy making and the decisions on who you ally with, and no doubt she would have been involved in the decisions about where they should go in that way. So I think on the broader sense, she's playing quite a leading part in this, without a doubt. When it comes to the battle itself, I think less so. So I don't think that, she's going to be making decisions about what moves they're going to make on the battle. But in the broader sense, the initial alliance with Warwick, for example, going to Wales, for example, those kind of things, I think Margaret is closely involved in those things. And, she is a driving force at this period. She is if the Yorkists have got Edward to encourage them, I feel that Margaret is an impressive woman, and I think that notwithstanding all the things we read about the role of women at that time, I think that she was an important player. She's an agent. She's not just things that happen to her, she makes them happen. So I always have there's a lot of people, earlier history sort of call her a she-wolf, and that she's not very nice, don't they? But I look at her and I think that she's got all of the characteristics that you would want of a monarch, actually, in the way that she is determined, she's loyal, she doesn't give up. She is cruel at times, but then monarchs have to be cruel. But these are all things that I think in the past are seen as male attributes.
Yeah, she's just a leader.
There's this woman taking a leading role and she does these things, and it shouldn't be happening. It's a woman, so it's kind of gender politics, gender history play.
Yeah, and maybe forced by a subsequent generation back, because clearly she's being listened to at the time.
Very much so. Very much so. All the way through the when she's able to. You look at the period at the outbreak of the Wars of the Roses. But, again, Lady Margaret Beaufort's another, these people are important agents in all of this, that it's not an all male affair at all. They've got a lot of, particularly, I think, sort of wider strategic or political agency is how I would look at it.
Mm. She's very clear. She's got a strategy anyway. She knows where she's aiming for. So let's talk about the battlefield itself. I'm keen to do this, and then we'll look at the battle and the people involved and what happens. So they don't intend to meet at Tewkesbury. I imagine there's quite a few reasons not to meet at Tewkesbury. I mean, anyone who's spent any time in Tewkesbury at whatever time of year will know that it's prone to flooding for a start, but we're talking a dry period. So how large is the battlefield? What's the terrain like? Where are the different sides managed to camp themselves? What are we looking at in terms of the physicalities of the terrain?
Well, Tewkesbury today has changed somewhat, simply because of the expansion of the town, and so perhaps half of the battlefield now is built upon. But luckily for us, the areas where perhaps the most important fighting took place are not built upon. So what you've got to think about Tewkesbury at the time was that you've got a smallish town built very much around the Tewkesbury Abbey. So you've got Tewkesbury Abbey in the centre, and you've got your town around it with some wharves going down to the River Severn. And then south of Tewkesbury, you've got open fields. You have the fields down there, and enclosed fields, often nearer to a town. You will get a lot of enclosures. So south of Tewkesbury, you've got some open fields, a lot of enclosed areas, some woodland, and a hillock, which they refer to. So it's sort of mixed terrain down there. Behind, and you imagine the Lancastrians, because they're hoping to cross over the River Severn, they've got the Severn at their back, really, which is not a great thing to do if you get defeated, because it tends to get in the way. The Yorkists are coming up really from the southeast, and so they're looking toward, they would have seen Tewkesbury Abbey in the distance, probably the tower of Tewkesbury Abbey, and they would have seen where the Lancastrians were drawn up. And if you go there now, there's an old pub called Gupshill Manor, which is a nice place for lunch before or after you look around the battlefield. Actually, perfect, really. And it said that it was in that area that Margaret camped with her army, and seems no reason to disagree with that. So, and the area, now these battles, it depends what you define as the battlefield, I suppose. If by the battlefield we mean the area in which the heavy fighting took place, it's a relatively confined area. I would say that we're talking about armies of maybe 4,000 to 5,000 aside. So it's not a huge number of people. Although I imagine if you're in Tewkesbury and 5,000 people turned up in those days, you'd have been a bit taken aback by it, especially when they started to nick all your stuff, give you typhus because they spread their lice to you, poo in your back garden, I don't know what, So 5,000 people, in some ways we could say it's a small army, but that's us looking at it. I reckon if you were a shopkeeper in Tewkesbury, you wouldn't have seen it that way at all, So not huge armies, and maybe the area of the fighting might be at a maximum a square mile, possibly less than that, maybe 3/4 of a mile by 3/4 of a mile. But of course, we also need to take into account, on top of that, the retreat that follows afterwards, the approach to the battle. So when for example, with the Battlefields Trust, we look at ensuring that battlefields are registered, which historic England do, you have to make a decision how far you register it for. Do you include part of the approach to the battle, part of the retreat? On the whole, it depends about how significant the approach or the retreat was and whether you include it. But we're talking here about a pretty, it's a pretty tightly packed piece of fighting. It's not a long, wide spread out at all. It's pretty compact.
Yeah. And you're right. There's quite a bit of it that you can still walk around. In fact, there's a battlefield walk. How accurate is the signage as you go around? So I think it claims that you're walking through the Yorkist camp, I think, and then also Bloody Meadow, where the sort of rout happened. So, is it pretty good? Have they got it?
It's tricky because, we always want accuracy with battles. It's very nice to be able to say you are standing on the very spot where something happened. And on some battles, it's easier than others. I mean, we have a slight problem always with understanding battles, that the people that wrote about them in the Middle Ages weren't writing about them with a view to enabling somebody to walk around the battlefield at a later date, or with a view to history. What they're interested in as much is what that battle meant rather than what happened. So, and also they can be quite formulaic. And a classic example of this is that some people have made a lot at Bosworth of the fact that it says that that Henry's army moved so they had the sun behind them, and people have actually looked and used that as a way of working out where the armies were. But this is something that's straight out of Vegetius and Christine de Pizan, who wrote. So they say these are the things that you should do. So therefore, if you're going to write an account of a battle that makes you look good, you slip them in, don't you? Because we moved around brilliantly, so we had the sun behind us. And oh yes, they know what they're doing. But I think one has to be a little bit cautious. Secondly, of course, the people that did the writing at the time didn't have any maps. So, I've done things overseas with the army, where you write a report afterwards and you've got maps to go back to. You think, what was the name of that village? I can't remember what it was called, and you go look it up, and do it in that way. And you remember things, don't you? So in that way, and then you can check them. They couldn't do that. And really, they weren't that bothered about doing it anyway. They're more interested in showing that, the intervention of God or the bravery of an individual person, etc. So, you've got that issue. They don't know where they are necessarily. None of them are from Tewkesbury. So therefore, they're not necessarily going to know, they're going to talk in general terms about, we came to an area of enclosure, or there was a huge hill. Well, what does huge mean? So if you see two sources that are quite similar, you have to look at what's going on, and is it that one is simply a rewriting of the other? So we've got one source which we really rely on, which is the arrival, but it's not precise about things. So therefore, you can never be dead sure from a source like that where something happens. If they say, well, we deployed in front of the hill, well, what does in front of mean? Does it mean with the slopes immediately behind you, or does it mean half a mile away? Exactly. So we kind of know where it took place, but it's very difficult to pinpoint where individual. There are some battles where you can. So, for example, Hastings. Loads of the accounts say that that Battle Abbey was built on the spot where Harold set up his standard. And you go there and it's on that highest point of the hill, and it makes absolute sense. So there we can. But on this battle, it's very difficult to be absolutely precise. So we have a rough idea, but if you look at accounts, one to another, they vary maybe by 200 yards about where the armies are deployed. Now, there are certain things that are not changing. And one, of course, is Tewkesbury Abbey. And it's worth going to Tewkesbury for the Abbey alone, really. And I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit later on. I'm always, but, people don't want to hear we don't know. You want to have, you've got to have some kind of narrative, So, I tend to, in things, say, we believe or it is thought. But actually,
it's very interesting what you say there around about the sources that, you could say, well, we've got a few sources. But then you also have to think, well, did they piggyback off each other? Are they writing for the similar sort of purpose? And like you say, just with your analogy of a football match, there are many people involved in that football match, and they will each have a different
their own truth,
their own truth, which is why truth maybe is.
I I have a lot of teachers who are interested in history, as we know, and it's always very amusing. They say, if there's some trouble in the playground and you get the two ringleaders together and ask them to give an account of what happened, they're both going to come up with a completely different account of who started, who did what, and it's of course it's quite interesting,
And in the case of a battle, like the obviously it's an old adage, the winners write history. You haven't got potentially the account of the losers. They're not going to be that interested in writing this down. And if it was going to survive, if they were going to even get opportunity, and if that would survive. So we've got the already battle-worn, frog-marched Yorkists under Edward IV. By this point, we have the three brothers back together, and they're pitched up against Margaret of Anjou's forces. Now, Margaret doesn't enter the battlefield, does she? But her son Edward, now 17, does.
He has to. It's expected of him, really, at that age. And 17, let's face it, Edward IV is kind of running the show at 19, isn't he? So, at 17 would have been considered majority. It's not like he's a child.
But what you say about him as well, he sounds like he is. That would be his choice as well. He wants to. He sounds quite bloodthirsty, actually, but he wants that opportunity to prove who he is, what he's there for, what he's about to hopefully achieve and do to follow on from that. So what's the day of the battle like? How I'm intrigued by things like, how does it get started? What happens?
Okay. this is a period where command and control, as we would call it, is quite difficult. Nowadays, you've got radios and you can signal and you can react to what's going on. In those days, you had to be a little bit basic in what you did, and there were some basic principles that tended to happen. And one was that you tended to deploy your army in 3 battles or 3 blocks of people. So imagine a block, 3 blocks of maybe 1,500 men, probably with the best armored people at the front. In that way, that would be the way to think of it. Quite a lot of missile troops. So all English armies from this period had a very high percentage of archers in them, but also gunners. They had hand gunners. One of the accounts talks about Edward going into London with a black and smoky sort of hand gunner. In other words, you can imagine that there's all the soot and what have you. They're coming in with these guns, with these burning tapers. So you've got hand gunners, light guns as well. They were like little cannons, really. They called them things like serpentines and things like that. Little guns that could either fire out a ball or hail shot. But of course, it's that, for example, it's those balls that helped us find where Bosworth was, because there was lots of guns at Bosworth, and it was finding those cannonballs of different sizes that enabled us to know where the fighting took place. So you've got your blocks of men, and they tended to be divided into the vanguard, the main wood, and the rear guard. And traditionally, the vanguard, when they deployed, it went over to the right. So imagine they're arriving on the battlefield. The vanguard will go over to the right. This is my right. The main wood, which is where the commanders are going to be, is going to come into the centre, and then the rear guard come over to the left. But exactly how that worked at both Barnet and Tewkesbury is a little bit uncertain. But it does appear that at Tewkesbury, Richard of Gloucester, who seems to have performed well at Barnet. Now, whether he performed well as an individual or whether his unit performed well is open to debate, but he seems to have not disgraced himself at that battle. So he's put over to the left. Edward has the centre. Clarence is very rarely given independent command because he's unreliable. His job is to be there, with his troops, but you don't want Clarence doing things because who knows what he's going to end up doing. And then it looks as though William Hastings, who's Edward's mate, has the right flank. That's the way that they're deployed. The Yorkists, the Lancastrians. The Duke of Somerset has the right flank. So because, of course, he's on the other side of the battlefield, you have to turn it round, if you see what I mean. So he's facing Richard of Gloucester. In the centre, you have Lord Wenlock and Edward. So you get this feeling that Edward is, nominal commander, but Wenlock is sort of advising him. That's the way I look at it. And then on the far side, you've got Courtenay, Earl of Devon. So they're facing each other. So it's 3 blocks facing each other. But there's a slightly more to it. Now, it appears that the Lancastrians cobbled together a plan. Now, when you read The Arrival, it says, I don't know whether they thought of this plan all along or whether, in fact, it was in reaction to what happened, because the initial part of the battle, and many of these battles started this way, you have an exchange of missile fire, so guns and archery and so on and so on. And, this famously happens at the Battle of Taunton in 1461, where the Yorkists win the archery duel, mainly because they have the wind behind them. And the Lancastrians are shooting into a blizzard and they can't see what's going on, and all their arrows fall short. The Yorkist arrows land amongst the Lancastrians, and then the battle starts. At this battle, it looks as though the Yorkists have the better of this exchange. The account suggests they have more guns, and so the Lancastrians are standing there in their lines, and they're starting to suffer casualties. So then they have to decide what to do. Now, it may have been as a result of this, but it looks as though the Lancastrians had cobbled together a plan, and the plan was that over on the Yorkist left, there was woods there, and the Yorkists couldn't see very much. In front of them, there were it appears that there were quite a lot of enclosures, so little hedges, big hedges, and little fields, and then there was these woods, and then a little bit further to the left, there was a big hill. And the Lancastrians got this idea. What we'll do is we'll go on a march behind the woods where the Yorkists can't see us, and we'll fall on their flank. So someone said, I'll do that. And then Wenlock and Devon, you attack, and we'll catch the Yorkists in the flank and the front, and we'll roll up their whole army. Brilliant plan, actually, on the face of it. You know, it's a tricky thing to try and do on a battlefield at that time, but that appears to be what the Lancastrian plan was. So it's a big hook round, using these woods as cover, and then emerge on the Yorkist flank, all being while the Yorkists are being kept busy by the other Lancastrians, and then you'll surprise them because they're being attacked in two directions at once. So that's the plan. However, like all plans, it never survives contact with the enemy, and it goes wrong in two ways. In fact, probably more than two ways. But the first thing is that Edward is no mug, and he understands battlefields. You know, he is he hasn't won at Mortimer's Cross and at Towton and at Barnet without having something about him. He's no mug at all. And he looks at the battlefield beforehand and he realizes that there is a possibility that his flank could be attacked. So he positions sort of further over on the battlefield 200 mounted spearmen, mounted knights, men-at-arms, to guard that flank. So he's thought about what he's going to do about it. So when the Lancastrians make their flanking attack, these spearmen ride in and attack the Lancastrians in the flank. So he's dealt with it. But it's only 200, and it's possible that he might have that Somerset might have succeeded in this. However, he's expecting Lord Wenlock and the Earl of Devon to also attack, and it doesn't happen. And Somerset finds the going hard because of all of these hedges, etc. Gloucester, Richard of Gloucester, the future Richard III, commands his men very well, and a combination of a stout defence, I think, difficult terrain, and these Yorkist spearmen suddenly appearing, the Lancastrians are pushed back. Now, to say that that Somerset is unhappy is an understatement. And one account says that he got back up on, with the remains of his troops. They're scurrying back to their lines. They've lost lots of people in this fighting. They've not made the progress that they thought they would make. And there's Lord Wenlock with saying they haven't moved. And so one account says that Somerset rode up to Lord Wenlock in a rage, got out his battle axe and brained him, killed him there on the battlefield. So suspecting him really of treachery is what the implication is in that way. Now, who knows why Wenlock didn't move? We can discuss that at a later date, maybe. But he didn't move. Whether that actually happened, whether Somerset did brain him or not, one account says it, but maybe you read that account, and is it like trying to understand Robert Bruce and William Wallace by reading Braveheart, watching Braveheart? Who knows whether it happened? But the fact is that the Lancastrian army it's lost one lot of troops when Wenlock is killed, whether it's by Somerset or in arrow fire or whatever. Losing that, the Lancastrian army dissolves really at this point, and it starts to flee off the battlefield, and the battle is won.
Right.
But the Greek question is, and I'm sure you're going to ask me this, how did people know that a battle had ended?
Yeah, well, it is actually a question that occurred to me when I was preparing for this. And I thought, actually, any battlefield, how do they actually know when it's won? It's not like there's a referee there. How do they know?
Well, it's a great question. And I think the answer is a lot of the time they didn't.
Okay.
So how would you know? Well, let's look at it. If you were fighting and your army had been defeated, you'd know that the battlefield, for you, the battle was over either when somebody comes up and shoves a spear in your stomach, or you find that you're surrounded and you surrender. And you wouldn't do that. You'd probably be doing this, wouldn't you? Please don't kill me, etc. Or panic spreads and you think, I've had enough of this and I'm running. Right. If you were a commander on the side that's losing, you'd probably look, and if you were alive to do it, you'd probably say, right, that's enough of that, we're off. Or you might surrender or you might try and tell your troops to pull back and go. So, but is that the end of the battle? Because a battle is also a big pursuit. And we know, for example, that after the Battle of Towton, bodies were found over like 25 square miles where they're running away. So is that part of the battle? You know, and a lot of casualties are in the pursuit. If you're the winning side, okay, how do you know the battle's over? Well, probably when there's nobody in front of you to fight, or when you're told to stop. If you've killed everybody, or the people in front of you have surrendered, or the opposition have run away, then the battle is over. But it's a very fluid thing. And on some battles, take, for example, the Battle of Flodden, one wing of the battle ended while the rest was carrying on. So on one side, basically the battle came to an end after about an hour, and both sides sort of stopped and just looked at each other. But the fighting continued elsewhere. At Agincourt, both the English and the French thought that the battle was over, and they got to that stage where they're almost going out to look for noble casualties, and the heralds are going out on that surcoat. There's the Duke of Alençon, and that's the Duke of York, and so they start noting down who's killed. But the third line of the French army, which arrived late, didn't know the battle was over, and they moved forward as though they're going to attack again. So everybody thought the battle was over. So, oh my God, there's more French coming. And coupled with an attack on the English baggage train by some sort of locals, suddenly, oh my God, it's the battle started again. And that's why Henry V ordered lots of prisoners to be killed at that point. And it's interesting, at the time, nobody saw what Henry V, he famously ordered the execution of all these prisoners. Nobody at the time saw it as a war crime. They blamed the French for restarting the battle when they'd clearly lost. So, it's a very sort of fluid thing. But, if you're in it, you're going to know because of simply what's going on around you. As you say, it wasn't calling time, although God could call time by making it dark. And nobody liked fighting in the dark. So you might say, well, we'll stop now. And then in the morning, you will start again. And by that time, one side or the other may have scarpered.
So with Tewkesbury, I think you've got the Lancastrians running away then back through town. But in principle, what's the kind of, you're talking there about war crimes, really, at what point is someone who's running away from you in a battle or have surrendered and you should be pulling back? Or is it just, what was there a convention as to what should happen?
Very interesting. And, we talk about chivalry and what have you. The thing about the Wars of the Roses battles is that they're all about killing the opposition leaders. That's what you're really fighting for. You're not really fighting, with the exception, I suppose, of the northeast where the Lancastrian castles are. You're not really fighting for control of land or to move a front line forward in that way. What you're trying to do is to take out the opposition leaders. And so these battles, from St. Albans in 1455 onwards, it's all about eliminating your rivals. And you may kill a lot of common soldiers, but your purpose, you do that in order to eliminate your rivals, not for any other particular purpose, because you don't want to kill too many people, because you need them to work the fields, don't you? And whatever. So you don't need the Duke of Somerset for that. So at these battles, for example, at the first Battle of St. Albans in 1455, the Yorkists, who are Richard of York, the original leader of the Yorkists, Warwick, the kingmaker, and his dad, they seek out and kill the Lancastrian leadership. So they kill the Duke of Somerset, they kill the Earl of Northumberland, they kill Lord Clifford. That's what they do. It's like a coup, really. And of course, that hacks off the sons of these people. And at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, the Lancastrians kill the chief Neville, Earl of Salisbury. They kill Richard of York. And of course, then Edward IV is in no mood for mercy. And at the Battle of Towkesbury, he gives the order, no mercy, and he kills a lot of the Lancastrian leadership. And it goes on like that. Although, interestingly, once the fighting's over, unless you were really beyond the pale, Edward IV made great efforts to bring Lancastrians back on side. Even the heir to the Dukedom of Somerset, he kind of tried to make friends with him. I think because he realised that, you can't just rule through the Nevilles. You've got to broaden your support than that. So in that way, but then you go back to battle again, 1471, and you get the same thing again. So both sides are trying to kill their leaders. You can try and surrender. People attempted to surrender. It's possible, for example, that Prince Edward attempted to surrender, but it was not going to happen.
So let's talk about that, because there's other things that happen after the battle.
Yes.
So let's first of all, let's talk about what happens to Edward. So is the only heir, the only hope of Henry VI, his only son. But what happens to him? Okay,
to put it bluntly, he's killed. Everything beyond that is a later elaboration.
Right.
So the circumstances in which he was killed, probably he was killed whilst fleeing. Probably in the same way, for example, that Warwick the Kingmaker was killed trying to get away after the Battle of Barnet, and other people were killed at other battles. So, and of course, I imagine he would have been very recognisable, because he would probably have been wearing his the arms of England, which both sides leaders would have worn, because they both saw themselves as kings. So, the arms of England quartered with that of France, with a label, which is like a white bar on it coming down, which showed that he was the eldest son in that way. And almost certainly he would have had a bodyguard around him. So if you were the victorious Yorkists, you'd see that group of people and you make a beeline for them. And then you would, the rest is history, really. Now, some accounts say that he was overtaken by the troops of the Duke of Clarence, and he cried for mercy, but Clarence would have none of it, and he was killed. And later accounts say that he was captured and brought before Edward the Fourth, and Edward the Fourth said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I've come back to get my my rightful inheritance." And Edward hits him with his glove, and he's killed there and then. That appears to be a sort of a later elaboration. I think all we can say about him was that he was killed in the fighting. It's all we can say, really. But it has a huge impact, because you're right. It's the last hope of the House of Lancaster, other than this guy called Henry Tudor.
Well, I have a special question about him that I'm going to ask you about.
But he's not going to account too much at this time. But also it's the death warrant for Henry VI, because the way I read it, they say, some of the accounts at the time say that he died of pure melancholy. But I suspect what happened was that the melancholy was a cushion.
Helped along by a pillow
on the head or whatever. And you think, well, why did the Yorkists keep him alive for so long? Because why not? Well, I think there's two reasons. One is that if you kept him alive, you could always get him out and say, "Look, you're opposing us. This is what you're fighting for. Look at this chap. He's never going to be king." And also, if you killed him, who's going to be the leader of the Lancastrian faction? His son, who's a far more dangerous proposition than his father. And so once the son has gone, there's absolutely no reason to keep the father, in my opinion. And so that's why he's killed. And really, that's that's to all intents and purposes. You could say that if the Wars of the Roses were a struggle between the House of Lancaster and the House of York, that the House of York wins the Wars of the Roses in those purely dynastic terms at that battle. Because after that, the army that Henry Tudor brings into action is we sometimes say it's Lancastrian, we sometimes say it's Tudor. A lot of them are Yorkists who don't like the seizure of power of Richard of Gloucester, and many of the people that fought at this battle for Edward go on and fight for Henry Tudor at the Battle of Bosworth. Many of his affinity go over that way. And some people, I guess if you were a Ricardian, you'd say that was a betrayal. But those people would probably have said that by seizing power, as he did, it was Richard that had betrayed the House of York. And so, that they saw it slightly different. So I always see Richard's army at Bosworth as a Ricardian army, not a Yorkist army. because there's so many Yorkists, former Yorkists, people that supported Edward IV and would have gone on supporting him if he hadn't have died so early over on the Lancastrian side. Just a little aside, incidentally, one of the great things about going to Tewkesbury in the summer is they've got this great project by which they have produced these painted banners of over 100 of the knights that fought, and they all hang out from the shop. So it's absolutely wonderful. You go through and look, there's, I don't know, Stanley, there's John Cheney, there's Richard. There, it's a real. I imagine you've been. It's a really colourful.
It looks fantastic. I was there with a tour group last year, and actually I'll be there end of June, start of July this year, and I think they leave the banners up during the summer, so after they've had their festival, which commemorates the battle. And the town just looks fantastic.
It's fantastic, isn't it? And it's just what you would want. I mean, they've really adopted, it's a tragic thing, a battle, but in terms of the identity of Tewkesbury, it's wonderful, isn't it? And those banners, I'll never forget. One year I went there, and you go and they have all the banners in the town hall, and the local shops come in and they pay like a tenner or something, and then you get your banner and a little bit of information about your particular person, and everybody wants to get, the one of Richard of Gloucester, and I've got one of the old ones of Richard of Gloucester when they produced new ones. I bought it off them. So it's in my shed at the moment. So I've got loads of these things. Everybody wants those. And then not so many people want the Stanleys because of what their purport of done it was. But it's absolutely super. But I remember going round and I found Edward IV's banner, and it was over a shop that was selling lingerie and bikinis and things like that. And I thought Edward IV would have loved that. Given what he was like, he'd have been so pleased that his banner was over such a place, But a wonderful local project. And as you say, well, your folk are going to have a brilliant time on their tour to go and see that. It's just so colourful, but it's so historical, isn't it? They've done great research on it, and I really liked it. Yeah.
So the Lancastrians are fleeing from the battlefield. Where do they actually go?
I think ideally you try and get home if you can, but of course these people are coming from a wide area. Some of them they're coming from, Devon, Northampton, all over the place. So that's not always very easy. And of course, you may not have a horse. You may think, well, I'm never going to make it through, Tewkesbury or anywhere. So you perhaps try and claim sanctuary. So a number of the Lancastrian leaders get into Tewkesbury Abbey, where they try to claim sanctuary. But Edward is having none of it. And essentially, with his troops, he enters the abbey and he drags them out. And then a couple of days later, Somerset, Roos, the Earl of Devon, etc., and many of the other knights that had fought on the Lancastrian side of this battle, they're tried and they're executed in Tewkesbury. And Somerset and some of those, they're buried in Tewkesbury Abbey.
The other person that we've not accounted for at the end of this battle, of course, is Margaret of Anjou.
She is eventually captured, but she's later ransomed by the King of France. But she ends her life really. I can't remember if she ends it in a nunnery precisely, but that's it for her. This is her very much her last hurrah. And so after this, she's lost her husband. She's lost her son. So what is there to fight for? And what ultimately for her is a foreign country. So for her, it's a rather tragic end, isn't it?
It is. It's just a loss of a very interesting woman there from history. So her time is done. So we're going to go on to Patreon questions in a moment. And in fact, we're going to dig. Do you want to?
So we've ended quite abruptly after. So you might want to say, you might ask me, well, okay, so Edward has won at Tewkesbury. What happens next?
Yes, okay.
And I might what I'll do is I'll just sort of say that there's still a bit of clearing up to do. He's still got, there's an attack on London by Fauconberg, which is seen off. But essentially, now he's going to reign unchallenged until his early death in 1483. But I'll say something about the Yorkist affinity. And I'll say that, that the only thing that held it together was Edward. And when he dies, you get a power struggle. And I say, but that's another story. And then that's worth it. We can talk about that. And you've probably done it, so we'll do it in that way.
Okay.
But that's an obvious end, isn't it? I think.
Yeah. Okay.
And I'll end it with, but that's another story, or something like that.
Fab.
Okay.
So we've had the battle. The Yorkists have won. Edward IV is what now? He's uncontested king. What actually happens next? Is this peace?
Yes, there's still a bit of, can I say, a bit of tidying up to do after this battle. There still are some Lancastrians in arms, and indeed one Lancastrian supporter who was Warwick's illegitimate nephew, a chap called the Bastard of Fauconberg, actually tries to attack London and is driven back. So there's still some fighting. But after the battle, really, Edward is unchallenged, and even, his the ultimate person that ends the House of York's reign, Henry Tudor, initially all that he, or at least his mother, wants for him is to come back and get his inheritance as Earl of Richmond. There's not initially any idea that he should be king. So there's nobody really challenging now Edward IV as king. And the second part of his reign, you can say that he can enjoy the fruits of victory, which I think he certainly did, because he kind of reminds me of Henry VIII in a way, that as a young man, he's very strapping and everybody loves him and all that. But as he gets older, gets a bit overweight and less healthy. And it looks as though Edward IV was just like that. Or maybe you should say that Henry VIII was like Edward IV. They're very, very similar in appearance, aren't they? When you look at them as photos, when you look at paintings of them as young people. So Edward IV is now king. He's able to enjoy his fruits of victory, but I think it's a mistake to think that the Yorkist affinity, by which I mean the people that have supported him, are in any way a united bunch. They're not. They all have their rivalries and their hatreds within each other. So on one hand, you've got the Woodvilles. It's pretty clear that his great friend, William Hastings, doesn't like the amount of power that the Woodvilles have got. You've got George, Duke of Clarence, who is a completely unreliable individual, trying to plough his own furrow. You've got there. You've got Edward's own household. So, those people that owe their sort of progress to him. And you've got Richard of Gloucester. So these people are they're rivals amongst each other. And the only thing really that holds them together is the person of Edward IV. And so when Edward IV dies unexpectedly in 1483, you've got a situation where these different parts, I think, of the Yorkist divinity start to tear each other apart. And of course, what you end up with is a situation where Richard of Gloucester seizes the throne. And that, of course, unleashes a chain of events which will lead to, a relatively unknown individual in Henry Tudor to come across and claim the throne and actually win at Bosworth. But of course, that's a different story.
It is. Actually, I have a question which I'm going to put to you in the patron section about the Wars of the Roses and whether the Battle of Bosworth should be included, but I'm going to save that for the patron only. So before we move on to those questions, we're going to say goodbye to people watching the main interview. But before we do that, can you let everyone know where they can find you online, what you might be working on, anything that you're about your work, what you're doing?
Oh, well, thanks for asking me. Well, what am I doing? Quite a lot of tours. Various tour companies are available, aren't they, out there? I'm doing I do battlefield walks for English Heritage. So if you're a member, have a look in their magazine and it tells you about that. If you just Google Julian Humphrys, a lot of the tours that I'm doing are out. At the moment, I'm writing for Tudor Places magazine, which is a great magazine with lots of information about Tudor sites. So I do battlefields perhaps inevitably, but also things like Oxbridge colleges, that kind of thing. I've just finished co-authoring a book which is called 500 Battlefields of the World. Phew. I didn't do all the world ones. I did the English ones, and if you see that around, I did the English entries for that. And I also write a lot of scripts for museums. So if you go along and you listen to one of those audio guides, as a tour leader, I don't like them because I want to talk to the people. But you get these audio.
But if you can't be there, your words.
So they have those. So I'm just finishing a new script for the D-Day Museum down in Southsea. I did one for Culloden and a number of other historic sites. So sometimes if we hear people sort of speaking about things, it might be my words that are out there. So I've got a variety of things, but I'm a bit of a Twitterer, really, a tweeter. So if you look at Jules Humphrys, in a bizarre twist, my name is Julian Humphrys, Humphrys. There's also a Julian Humphrys, Humphrys, who is also a battlefield guide. How could you couldn't make it up, could you? So it causes all kinds of confusion. But so you make sure you be up under Humphrys, Humphrys, and you'll see what I'm up to. And thanks for listening, everybody. I hope that was of some interest,
Fantastic. Thank you, Julian.
By the time you come to Bosworth, it's not a Lancastrian army that fights for Henry. It's not a Yorkist army that fights for Richard.